All right, well, we're going to get going and let any little latecomers on catch up as they can. So, good morning. My name is Darren. For those who don't know me, I'm the nursery manager here at Shonnard's, and I do a lot of our class work. I wanted to take some time today to talk about resilience in the gardening. So, if you paid any attention to either what's on the news or what's happening in the outdoor world around you while you're out in it, you're very aware that over the last few years, things are showing change. And as we look back a few years or we look forward a few years, realistically, change is in the forecast. And that will not be any kind of linear or even very predictable change. There's going to be a fair amount of randomness involved. So, in the narrow facet, getting outside of our ecological, economic, and political approaches, as gardeners, as landscapers, as people who enjoy working with plants in the outdoors, how do we cope? What can we do to make our gardening practices more resilient to the changes around us? This is an industry that's changed dramatically in the last 10 years, and even more dramatically in the 30-some years I've been doing it. And it's not the same. And it's time we address that and maybe encourage people to adopt different techniques or different styles of gardening to be fully accountable to the changes that are happening. So that was kind of the impetus of today's class. We have an online presence, so it's a hybrid class as well as our in-person class attending. So pardon me if I'm a bit distracted between the two. I will ask that we hold questions until the end of the session. There'll be ample time to either type questions in the chat bar or come online and chat, or for people here to ask questions as we hit the end. But I find it very difficult to keep a flow of talk if I'm getting a lot of questions from both sides. So we're talking about resilience in the garden. What are our big areas of concern? What is changing in our environment? The big one that gets all the press attention, in the last few years especially, is drought and heat. And they're different, but they kind of coexist together. They're not identical, but they share some causes and some effects. The other side of that issue is flooding. So what happens with changes in our climate, whether that's on a global scale or regional, is that intense weather events become more intense, whether we're talking intense drought or intense rainfall. Rain falling at odd times of the year contribute to a very fast snow melt issues, which can cause flooding as well. So flooding is another environmental aspect that we need to be aware of and take into account in our planning for our gardens and landscapes. Fire. Having grown up in Western Oregon, I spent my entire life in Western Oregon, I am utterly astounded by the change in what we have to expect and deal with. These last few years have been utterly astonishing and should be a wake-up call for everybody that no matter where you are located, you should be aware of fire risks, and even more so as you get into the wooded fringe, of course. But urban spaces are not immune to fire considerations. And biodiversity. So what happens in agriculture with an increasingly large volume of monoculture plantings that are definitely dedicated to space, less marginal space, more of the marginal space is being occupied by farmland, and crops are neither being as frequently exchanged nor as interplanted. In other words, we have larger and larger swaths of single crop at a time locations. That's a problem for biodiversity. That's traditionally been our resource base. So what we've seen in the last basically couple of decades in particular is that now urban and suburban areas are showing a greater potential for biodiversity in fauna, pollinator diversity, small mammal and bird diversity. They're becoming the refuge from the intensively monocultured farming, right? So we need to address that. We need to be aware that we are having impacts. And this is not just about pollinator health, though that is one of the big topics and one of the big issues in the news. Large-scale repetitive monoculture plantings in ornamentals also encourage disease and pest problems, and that's something we need to be aware of and address. Now, what we're going to talk today about is three major aspects of gardening, landscaping, that we can address some of these concerns in and make our processes more resilient. Food gardening and orcharding. Heavy emphasis on the vegetable garden in that part of it. Lawn and turf, and dealing with those situations in settings that are amenable to our new environment. And lastly, ornamental landscaping, trees, shrubs, and perennials. So first of all, we're going to talk a little bit more about these concerns, and then we will kind of take a top 4 approach to resilient techniques, and then applying those resilient techniques in these specific areas. Heat and drought. Okay, so we are a Mediterranean climate. We are Central California. We are French foothills. We have a climate that has a very distinct wet season and a very distinct dry season. And people who aren't from around here don't perhaps recognize that as much as those of us who grew up in it. We basically go 3 to 4 months of the year with little or no measurable rainfall, making us Mediterranean by definition. The flip side of that is we do get quite a bit of rain. We're not an arid climate. It's just compressed into roughly 6 or 7 months of significantly heavy rainfall. So this distinct dry season has always been a challenge for gardeners and landscapers, figuring out plants that will survive it, or figuring out techniques to apply the water the plants need. However, it's not what it was when I was growing up here. It's distinctively less predictable and distinctively more intense. And a couple of years ago, I'm sure you all remember, at 110 degrees in the first week of June. That is unheard of. And unfortunately, those are things we now have to be considering and planning for. So this is a very current snapshot up here on the photo from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. And this was, I think, yesterday's, or what was it, the 13th of October, I guess, their snapshot of where we are at in moisture, U.S. drought conditions. And if you look, we are in significant drought, even though we had a fairly moderate summer this year. And so this is kind of an ongoing cumulative thing, because not only do we have to worry about the actual local and regional changes in our rainfall patterns, but also our long-term snowpacks and glaciation, which are traditionally where a lot of our water comes from. So there are long-term as well as short-term ramifications of heat and drought events, and they're not always obvious until you look at them in retrospect over a larger period of time. Now, we're talking about both heat and drought. They go hand in hand. They're not the same. Dealing with heat issues requires one set of solutions, but some of those solutions are not particularly drought resistant. And so finding that middle ground and that mediation point that is practical for both is our big concern. So when we talk about coping with heat, we should be dealing not only with our landscape and plant stresses, but human stresses as well. And for those of us who work outdoors most of the day, most every day, these last couple of years in particular have been stunning wake up, and we find ourselves, like, as managers now, watching heat index maps throughout the day on all summer long to make sure we're not over impacting our staff. So the things you can do in the sphere of landscaping to cope with heat stress: water for your plants, water for you. Water reduces the effects of heat stress. Water does not eliminate heat stress. It is a part of a coping mechanism for heat stresses. Providing shade. So in other words, trees are your friends, and selecting the right trees to provide good shade that are not particularly thirsty and getting established and are efficient in fire-wise goes a long way to reducing some of these heat problems. In the plant world, understand that there is a difference between the exposed heat on the foliage and canopy and heat in the soil. You can ameliorate a lot of the impacts on plants from heat by mulching and by providing smaller plants around them to provide shelter over the root zone and crown and that can substantially reduce heat stress to otherwise susceptible plants. You can't really do that to people, I'm afraid, under ideal conditions anyway. However, you can landscape to encourage airflow. Be aware of prevailing winds, which are seasonally variable. They're not consistent season to season in Western Oregon. And make sure you're not creating the hard structural blocks that make the wind avoid you, but you're encouraging wind flow to help keep you cool. On the landscape sphere, we can focus on plant selection, plants that are naturally from hot regions but are still well adapted here. And we'll talk about that more later in the presentation. Drought, on the other hand, plant selection is the key biggest factor. Now, when you have an established landscape, of course, you may have to do some modification, or you may have to live with what you've got, and you have to make some decisions. But when you're doing anything new in planting, consider plant selection to focus on drought resilience specifically. Native plants. Many of our native plants have excellent tolerance for severe amounts of drought. On the other hand, as we found out a couple of years ago, native Doug firs, they burned at 110 degrees in June. They had the new growth was out, so the timing does matter. But in general, native plants give you some resilience to the anticipated conditions, which is a dry summer climate in the first place. We can also select plants from other dry regions, whether that be Chile, whether that be Mediterranean Europe, southwestern US. However, when you're trying to plant for a specific cause, you need to be aware that we have other challenges, including a very, very wet winter, and in our immediate area, heavy clay soils, which sometimes makes some of these drought-resistant plants not viable, practical options in this area. So it's one thing to source plants from other regions, but be aware of other limitations. Planning and planting go a long way to reducing water need and improving plant performance vis-a-vis drought. Soil improvement, as I mentioned, we're on a heavy clay base. So any amount of organic mass worked into that soil will improve the ability of that soil to hold and release moisture. Clay holds moisture when it gets wet just fine, but it doesn't always give it back as the plants need it. And often heavy clays can cause lamination, where the water moves around rather than down. Plant plants in clusters. So when we're talking about drought, we're not just talking about strictly about plant survival. We're also talking about being water-wise. Grew up in the valley, Western Oregon. We've always kind of assumed that we have all the water we need. I would not expect that to be the case 20 years from now. Between the variations in climate, but also the amount of people moving in from drier climates and issues that are causing those kinds of migration, don't expect that we will always have free and ready access to as much water as we want for gardening and landscaping. So plant clusters of like water need plants. If you can consolidate your irrigation and your irrigation timing to focus on the plants that really need it and not so much the ones that don't, you can substantially reduce your water load compared to intermixing plantings and having to water the whole thing. Getting plants well established is critical for drought tolerance of plants. A real common approach is to slap a plant in the ground in April, then hand water it with a watering can or a hose sporadically over the summer. And the problem with that is that it creates a shallow, broad root system. The water that you're putting on with those short applications never goes down deep into the soil, encouraging deep roots. On the other hand, if you take the time to deep water young plantings, whether that's a hose on a trickle for a long period of time on a tree, or a watering bag like a gator bag that you fill up with water and it spends several hours trickling down in, or a timed drip system that applies very small amounts of water over a longer run, all of those will encourage deeper root development. Deeper root development encourages drought resilience in plants. Our overall goal here is, of course, healthy, happy plants, but also to use less water, to use our water more efficiently. We're not going to be able to always just water our way out of a drought. So concepts like dry gardening vegetables or rain gardening for ornamentals are some techniques that you can use to reduce your water demand overall. For areas that do need water, you can control the application method and the timing of the watering to improve your efficiency in watering. And that goes a long way to reducing your water use. And as I mentioned earlier, mulching to reduce evaporative losses and to keep the root systems cool improves the plant's ability to utilize that moisture you're putting on efficiently. So, as I said at the outset, of course, we have a Mediterranean climate, which means we have a distinct dry season, but it also means we have a distinct and extensive wet season. So one of the big differences we see as botanists, gardeners in plant material, East Coast, West Coast. So even at the same latitudes with very similar temperature ranges, similar precipitation volumes. If you look at East Coast, they get areas that get 45 to 60 inches of rain a year. It's pretty well distributed. In fact, a lot of it comes in the summer, pretty well distributed through the season. We get 45 to 60 inches of rain, depending a little bit on where you are in the valley here. And we get it concentrated in about 6 months for the most part. So it's a very different volumetric of water coming down. So what is normal in Western Oregon? Well, I lived here my whole life and I can't tell you. I can tell you that we do seem to be seeing more swings in what is normal. Definitely more extremes of water events as well as heat and dry events. Is it really practical to plan plantings and landscape design around 100-year or longer interval events? No, it's really not. There are situations where you might be able to implement plans that are look that far out, but ultimately you need to plan for what is going to be practical. So we're going to talk about surface flow issues and river rising issues, and they're different. So river rising is large amounts of water and melt events over fairly substantial periods of time. This is not a unless you're right on the riverfront, this is not a one storm, two storm thing. This is a long-term pattern of atmospheric river bringing huge amounts of tropical moisture, and after we've had substantial snowfall in the mountains, and it's melting that snowfall and it's feeding all these rivers dramatically. In situations where you are in a river floodplain, it is perhaps a little more practical to think a little bit longer term, and whether that's in terms of protecting your house with grading, or protecting your plants with berming and mounding, or simply plants that really tolerate heavy flooding. Surface flow is when the immediate small streams and or drainage systems and urban drainage systems cannot handle the immediate load. And this is the picture you see. I forget exactly what year that led in 2012. So that's my house. That's looking out from my front door at people canoeing down the street. Okay, so this was a random event, kind of a one-off in many regards. And this is a surface flow issue. The infrastructure had not been cleaned sufficiently before the rain came through, and the small streams just simply backed and backed and backed until it was all just surface flood. Came up fairly fast, went down fairly fast, and this was a series of really sharp short storms. So it wasn't a long-term thing. Normal landscape plants that have good water tolerance and just normal elevations will often survive brief inundation. And so you don't always have to be super flood conscious if your anticipated flood period is 48 hours or so, right? You have to be aware of foundational issues. You have to be aware of the potential for trees toppling, but realistically, that's not going to kill anything except the most water sensitive plants if they're saturated for that period of time. So, of course, as we said in the drought section, these local flood events, and particularly the rainfall versus snowfall events as we get warm fronts through in the winter, will have a substantial impact on water availability, and that's likely to get worse and worse. So the other part of the flooding event is after a flooding event like that, you've lost your snowpack. You're likely to have a very, very dry summer follow up, and be aware of that and plan accordingly. So how do we deal with water coming through? Large scale changes. So this is going to be grading to make sure that water is moving around your house, not through your foundation. This can be making sure that you have some direction the water can move when it comes down or when it rises. It can also include very localized drainage. So I'm on a wetland environment, northeast Corvallis, right? A nominal water table in the winter under normal conditions can be anywhere from 6 inches below the soil surface to 1 inch over the top. So it's quite wet. So I provide localized drainage on my property line. I am a little bit above my neighbors to begin with, just the house was like that, lot was like that when we bought the place. So I put in some curtain drains around the back side of the house in the vegetable garden to allow surface water to run into a spot where it can accumulate and perk down slowly, and rather than sitting as an inch layer across the whole backyard, it can be 3 feet or 4 feet in a rock-lined trench. So that's localizing your drainage. For individual plants, planting plants that are drought tolerant, but maybe not quite as wet tolerant, you can create berms and mounds. You can change the contours of the surface and plant on top of it. Getting the roots out of the worst of the permanent water table makes a big difference to those plants. So does soil improvement. The ability of the soil to handle moisture coming in and going out, and the lack of the decrease of soil deoxygenation, where you have so much water in the soil that there's no air for the roots to live on anymore. Bottom of the planting pole techniques to improve the water drainage are only so effective. The problem with digging a deep hole and filling it with rock and then planting on top of it is our fine textured clay soils become aqueous in the winter. They just infiltrate that rock, and pretty soon you have concrete instead of gravel in that area, and that doesn't drain at all. So you're definitely ahead to spend more time and effort on improving the soil in the immediate plant root zone and or berming up, getting them above the water table, than you are to changing the actual depth of the hole and trying to provide drainage there. Of course, we can select plants for relative wet soil tolerance. This does not have to be riverine and wetland plants, but a surprising number of plants are very adaptable to having quite a bit of water, at least seasonally, if not all the time. We have a very broad panoply of native plants that are extremely well adapted to either wetland environments or seasonal wet, seasonal dry environments. There are also plants from other similar wet soil environments. A lot of the east and southeast have a lot of plants that are used to heavy soils and wet conditions and can be very well adapted here. Again, as with drought, though, we do have to keep in mind that plants that have wet soil tolerance may not be super drought tolerant nor super fire resistant, and so consider them and plan accordingly. When we talk about fire resistance is a relative term. You get the right mix of conditions, plants will burn, even fire-resistant plants. So there are no such thing as fireproof plants, but there are plants that are fire-resistant or fire-susceptible. Fire-susceptible plants have some things in common. They tend to accumulate dead debris load, whether that's dead branches, dead needles, small twigs in the interior that are shading out. They tend to have volatile, scented, you'll notice the scent on volatile oils, or similarly flammable oils in the foliage or in the branches. This is what happens with a lot of conifers, for example. And they tend to be readily ignited. They tend to not have a clean clearance. So plants, on the other hand, that are fire resistant tend to shed clean. They tend to not keep a lot of dead debris up in the canopy or up in the branches. They tend to not have volatile oils, even if they have a lot of foliage, and even if a lot of foliage drops in the winter, they tend to not have a lot of things that make that foliage super susceptible while it's green on the tree to ignition. And they tend to have either thick bark or clear trunks or some combination thereof that reduce their ignition risk. So we'll talk some more about some fire-resistant plants specifically a little later, but think of deciduous trees. So the vast majority of broadleaf deciduous trees are very fire-resistant. They typically have clean trunks, fairly thick bark, difficult to ignite. They tend to drop clean when they drop leaves. They tend to not accumulate a large amount of branch material inside. Tends to drop when it dies out. This is not to say that they're fire immune, and especially old mature trees that have a lot of large branch shed. If that's not cleaned up, they could provide ladder fuels getting up, right? On the flip side of that, look at something like a juniper. So a juniper has a lot of very flammable volatile oils in it. It keeps several years worth of dead needles trapped in the interior, which are ignition sources. They often have, even on the tree forms of juniper, they often have foliage all the way down to the ground and branches all the way down to the ground, making them easy for fire to ladder up into. So those are some of the characteristics you want to pay attention to when you're making plant selection. And above and beyond that, there are great lists out there. I'm going to present a few, and then I'll give you some references for some other resources. So the strategies here for dealing with fire are to provide defensible space, a way for you to be safe in your house or a way for you to safely get out of your house. This includes having clear space around the foundation of the house, which means basically a zone about 5 feet from the foundation, having non-flammable plants or low flammability plants and low flammability mulches. So letting weeds and grass grow right up against the foundation is a no-no. But bark mulches up against the foundation are really not a great idea either. You need hardscape, rock, pavers, that kind of thing, to reduce your fire risk. Similarly, you need to keep some clear space in the overhead sphere. A lot of the risk for fire comes from trees igniting and then spreading up to the roof of the house. So a good general rule of thumb is to have no branches encroaching within 10 feet of your roof. Ignition risk, clean up dead plant debris. That's probably the single biggest thing you can do in a lot of scenarios, is make sure that you don't have the things that ignite readily accumulating where they can be a fire risk, particularly as we get into the fire season. Low flammable vegetation. This can be dried lawns, this can be dried meadows, this can be scrub and brush. So, of course, the higher it is within that sphere, the more risky it is. Green, well-watered vegetation is really hard to ignite. Dead brown vegetation is really easy to ignite. General rules of thumb on that are 4 inches of height. If you've got dead brown vegetation within your defensible area, say within roughly 100 feet of the house, you should be keeping it cleared down to a height of no more than 4 inches. That dramatically reduces the ignition risk and the laddering capability.
I'm sorry, what was that, please?
4 inches, below 4 inches. So a fuel ladder is simply the concept that you get an ignition point, and then from the ignition point, things spread laterally at basically the same basal level they're at until they find something they can go up, and heat and flame rises. So you can get a little bit of ignition going in some low plant debris, and then it finds some flammable shrubs and it goes up the shrubs. And then if those shrubs are adjacent to the low-hanging branches of nearby trees, then those branches ignite, and that's the fuel ladder from low to medium to high. You restrict your fuel ladders by keeping cleared space under flammable trees. So keeping scrub, brush, large weeds, and shrubbery cleaned from underneath it, and also low-hanging branches from the trees themselves pruned away so they don't become the next ladder point to get the flame up into the tree itself. You can improve your resistance for existing plants. So of course you can plant more flame-resistant plants, but even plants that are existing in your landscape, you can improve their ignition resistance by maintaining good health. Dead branches and dead leaves burn readily, are easily ignited. Dried out plants, so proper irrigation is relevant. Controlling the vigor. This can be pruning on vigorous shrubs, or this can be mowing in lawns and meadows. And again, the isolation event, the ability to use non-flammable mulches to keep groups of plants apart. Thinning is extremely relevant in this context. So we talk about removing shrubs from under trees and low-hanging branches from the trees, but we also shouldn't have large clusters of trees where their branches intertwine or are immediately adjacent. Larger individual trees are better than clusters of moderate-sized trees in terms of fire resistance. So biodiversity affects a lot of different aspects of gardening. And it's mostly about an awareness of our impacts on our ecosystem, both in the natural world around us, but also on man-made ecosystems like gardens and landscapes. The big topic in biodiversity usually is talking about pollinator health, pollinator diversity. This applies both to our native plants, which have specific ranges of pollinators that favor them, and to our edibles. Understand that a big chunk of what we eat was brought in from other places. Some of our native pollinators do well on it, some of them don't. This is why we have honeybees, which are not native. So having broad pollinator diversity is beneficial for both our edibility, but also for our ornamental and wildscapes. Monocultural plantings produce some specific risks to biodiversity. And of course, habitat risk, they're not providing the range of habitat due to different bloom times and food resource times. But also, the more genetically identical any group of plants are, the more likely you are to have a specific pest or disease come in that particular organism is susceptible to. And the picture here is one of the new ones that we're really super concerned about in Western Oregon. This is the emerald ash borer. They have found some in Eugene now, some of the first outbreaks west of the Rockies. Emerald ash borer eats, as its name suggests, ash tree. It's a borer, it gets in under the bark, and does tremendous amount of gallery damage underneath the tree bark, girdling and eventually killing ash trees. If you have been following the news on emerald ash borer on the East Coast, which if you're not in the industry, you may not even be really aware of, you can now go through the Midwest and you can see miles of urban streets with no live trees because they planted block after block after block of ash trees for urban shade trees. They're very effective urban shade trees. I got one in my front yard. We got one in the front of the nursery here. But that monoculture planting was devastating. This particular pest is super well adapted and it's very obviously widely adaptable, as we found out in Midwest, Western Oregon, Southeast, and it's devastating its ability to just wipe out ash trees. So this is a problem for us from an ornamental perspective. Of course, we do use a fair amount of ash in landscaping. We have for a long time, but we also have a tremendous population of native Oregon white ash, particularly in erosion and flood-prone areas along the rivers. And they are susceptible to this borer. So promoting plant diversity isn't just about pollinator diversity. It's also about reducing and eliminating the risks of these very large-scale die-off events. So what do we do in biodiversity? How can we improve our biodiversity? Provide water resources in the garden. As simple as bird baths, as complex as full pond and stream systems. Water encourages breadth of life. Don't spend tons of time and effort on the Better Homes and Gardens manicured landscape. Okay. Allow some native bare soil patches for some of our native pollinators. Allow some dead twig mass in the brush, some dead twig mass in the trees for cavity nesting insects. Don't assume that a perfectly manicured lawn is a healthy lawn. Plant selection is probably the biggest thing we can do to promote biodiversity. Native fauna, both larger and smaller, both the big mammals, the moderate-sized birds, and the little bugs, prefer native plants. That's not to say they can't adapt to non-indigenous plants, but these critters and these plants co-evolved, and this is what these critters are looking for in a food source. They have built up a history of utilizing them. So it is usually the perfect match for your native fauna to work with native flora. There are, however, a wide range of non-native plants that are quite acceptable to native pollinators and native birds and native mammals. So don't be too hesitant to integrate them into your landscapes either. Again, monoculture versus variation. So in the sense of biodiversity, we're no longer talking about health risks. We're talking about having a variety of bloom times and or fruiting times, seasons of interest, where our native fauna can make utilization of these plants. So as we note with honeybee, of course, being active throughout the year, they need constant food sources through the year, but they're not native. Our native pollinators, primarily bumbles and then solitary bees, many of them have very distinct, very narrow windows of activity. Orchard mason bee, they first start emerging maybe mid to late March. They have adults flying March, April. By the 1st of May, they're done. The adults are done. They emerge, they reproduce, they pollinate things, and then they lay their eggs, and the entire rest of their life cycle for 10 months out of the year is egg to larva to pupae. Right? So if they don't have those food resources they're looking for in that 6-week window, the population will diminish or disappear in a specific area. Seedlings, when we're talking about natives, are valuable. Having genetic diversity within a population is important. Why is that such a big deal besides the disease and insect susceptibility issue? Well, if you look at the diversity of a group of plants, our native checker mallows are perhaps a great illustration of this. You'll find that distinct groups of checker mallows from distinct seed sources bloom at slightly different times, providing a broader range of pollination interest, well, for them pollinating their and developing their own progeny, but also providing resources for flora and fauna. The other end of that scale is cultivars. So cultivars are clones. You find a plant you like, you take a cutting, it's genetically identical to the parent plant. This is something we do a lot in the nursery industry because we want a plant that we can say, when we sell it, this plant is going to get this big with this color flower at this time. So it's intentional. But having a lot of that specific cultivar being available does diminish the overall species variability within that region, because those are the genes that are propagated even when they're pollinating plants that aren't of that clone in the first place. So something to be aware of in terms of relevance of biodiversity is getting plants either of different cultivars of the same type of plant, or getting seedlings that have can express some of the genetic variability of the parent species. This can both improve plant resilience and its attractiveness to the fauna. Pesticide use always has to come up in any time we're talking about diversity. I am a mostly 90-some% organic gardener at home. I'm not going to push the organic. I just want you to be reluctant to take chemical intervention. And when you do take chemical intervention for disease, pest, or weed control, to do so carefully with an eye on non-target exposures. Is this a product that has a long-term activation in the environment? Does it stay in the soil? Does it get into the water? Is this a product that is very selective or very non-selective? Does it hit just a targeted range of insects or a targeted range of weeds, or is it very, very general and broad? Safe use. Pollinators are active in the warm part of the day. Pesticides are at their most intense when they're first applied. If you can concentrate your application of pesticides to the dusk period in the evening, you'll have much less non-target exposure because less of the active ingredient is still active as those animals and bugs come out to utilize it. So be cautious, be reluctant, and be respectful of your use of pesticides. And as with water, there's no substitute for spending time out in your garden and landscape and seeing what's happening, catching problems before they get out of hand, and addressing those needs rapidly rather than realizing 2 weeks later that the aphids really are out of control and I need to spray everything. Attention matters. So those are kind of the issues and some overarching concerns in them. The questions now are, we love gardening. We love our landscapes. We love our vegetable gardens, our orchards. and some of us love our lawns, I'm assuming. Are there ways that we can continue doing this that are more resilient to the challenges we're facing? The next question that comes in line with that is, are there alternative approaches, alternative plants, alternative covers of soil that are more in tune with what we're seeing in changes in our environment? And lastly, at the minimum, at the very least, can we not continue to contribute to the problems through our gardening activities? So we're going to talk about 4 major strategies for resilience, and then about how those integrate into specific fields of landscape and gardening. Top strategy for improving gardening resilience: choose the plants that suit the challenges you are actually facing. That will be different on an individual by individual basis. It's different along the bank of a river than it is way uphill on the mountain. It's different down here on the valley clay than it is on Witham Hill, where there's contour and different soil structures. So what are our options in that regard? Native plants. Native plants offer some great options for solving a batch of these challenges. And we have actually a great number of plants for very dry climates. We have a great number of plants for very wet situations. And we have a surprising array of plants that can be underwater or near underwater in the winter, briefly underwater in the winter, and yet still tolerate getting very, very dry in the summer. That's not a common adaptation, and we have native plants that do that. In addition, native plants are usually available in seedling form rather than, or in addition to, clonal form. That's not true of a lot of ornamentals. And our native plants are definitely our preferred food source for mammals, birds, and insects. Outside of natives, we start looking to regions of the world that have similar environmental conditions to what we're facing. If your biggest concern is drought resilience, look at plants from Mediterranean Europe. These are rocky hillsides in dry summer, hot summer environments. Chile is not as hot, but Chile is quite dry in many of its regions. And so, very Mediterranean climate pattern. Lots of Chilean plants will adapt here, but a fair number of the ones we might enjoy are actually not quite cold tolerant enough for this far from the equator. The southwestern US has a tremendous array of very drought resistant plants because obviously it's an arid environment. The challenge with working with plants from the Southwest are twofold. Some of them are not temperature adapted. A surprising number of them are. The northern parts of Texas, Arizona, any elevation, even into Mexico, are surprisingly cold in the winter. And there's a lot of plants that will tolerate that. But very few of those southwestern plants are very well adapted to 6 months of rainfall. So be aware of that consideration as well. If, on the other hand, you're dealing with more of a concern about flooding issues, look to Western China and to the eastern U.S., particularly the southeastern U.S. for plant options. Those are both wetter climates where the moisture is more consistent, and they typically include plants from regions that are boggy or wetland environments. So certainly not all plants from the East Coast and not all plants from Western China are wet soil tolerant, but there's a pretty good array of them that are. Fire resistance plants are more of a chore to chase. There are great references online, and in the references I'll include at least one good listing there, but you'll have to hunt around a little bit. What I really want you to do, though, is take a look at these lists of plants and see who are the real star performers. What plants are fire resistant, tolerate at least brief flooding, and are very drought tolerant once established. These are resilient plants. These are what you want to kind of incorporate into your landscape. Another strategy for developing resilience is to be cognitive and aware in the planning and planting stages of gardening and landscaping. You can group plants with similar water needs together to reduce the overall irrigation being put out. And that's an underutilized strategy, as we tend to willy-nilly throw plants from very different environments together and expect them to grow together under our care. Rain gardens are an interesting approach. So rain gardens are gardens that are collecting hard surface runoff. This can be from your roof and down your gutter system, or this can be shedding off of hard surfaces like driveways, patios, and sidewalks. So those situations get very inundated in the winter because you're focusing on a large volume of square feet of moisture onto a very small area where it runs off. So the concept of doing a rain garden is to plant plants that will tolerate that degree of flooding, but that do not require summer irrigation to survive, in some cases thrive. There's a lot, the focus on rain gardening is very heavily oriented towards native plants, so there are some non-native candidates that could be integrated as well. Plan plant diversity in. Plan to have plants that have a wide range of bloom and or fruit seasons, and mix them up. Mix up the genetics with different varieties of the same species or with seedlings where available to create some genetic diversity within the groupings. And always keep in mind fire risk. This is going to be an estimate. I never realized growing up on a farm in Western Oregon how much I would come to loathe the 4th of July. I'm quite indifferent to people having fun. It's great, but they're not careful. And by the 4th of July, now we are dry. It wasn't necessarily the case in the 70s, So even urban spaces, be aware of fire risk. Plan for low flammability plants. Plan to incorporate clear space around the foundation to a distance of about 5 feet from the foundation. Plan to create islands of plants with mulch or low cover around them that is low flammability. And for water movement, create contour. A lot of the developed areas in urban spaces are very, very flat. So what happens is the water does build up pretty consistently over a large area, but you can actually change that by very minor changes in grade. If you create a mound that is 6 to 8 inches above the surrounding grade, you've gone from having to deal with really wetland plants to dealing with plants that are tolerant of brief inundation but aren't necessarily wetland plants. And that broadens your palette tremendously. Best watering practices. If you take nothing else home from this today, let's get our watering on key for our modern realities. Water the soil, not the foliage. Overhead watering is not complete anathema, but it is inefficient. Water deeper, not more frequently. You're watering your lawn 15 minutes in the morning, every morning, you're not developing a resilient lawn and you're wasting water. You're much ahead to water 30 to 40 minutes, 2 to 3 times a week to get that water down. Drip systems do a marvelous job for larger plants of doing that very effective. Water in the morning, not in the evening. Evening is second best. Middle of the day is the worst. What percentage of the water you put down is simply evaporating? Okay, so the problem with evening watering is that you create a very humid microzone where the water goes down. This can encourage disease problems with the water sticking around on the foliage and around the crowns of the plant for long periods of time. If you water in the morning, particularly as close to dawn as you can tolerate, then the water goes into the soil to the extent it can. You have a minimal evaporative loss. But then as the sun comes out, that water that's remaining behind evaporates out and dries up. And so it does reduce some of those problems affiliated with overhead watering or other non-specific waterings. And then reduce the evaporative loss long-term by mulching. 2 inches of mulch around perennials, trees, and shrubs can be a marvelous conservation of water. A couple of things about mulching. When you're mulching woody plants or perennials with above ground crowns like rhubarb, gunnera, visualize the donut. Put your 2 inches of mulch in a ring around the plant, but not in contact with the plant tissue. Sometimes crowns and even tree crowns and stems of shrubs can rot if you have a mulch layer, especially a heavier mulch layer, 2 or 3 inches in contact with. Types of mulch vary. There's pros and cons to all of the above. Compost mulches provide both beneficial soil biology and do a pretty good job of moisture retention, but don't suppress weeds worth a darn. Bark mulches do a pretty good job of suppressing weeds and holding moisture in, but they're nitrogen negative. They tend to take nutrients from the surrounding soil as they break down. Bark mulches are also notably flammable under bad conditions, so something you want to be aware of. Gravel or rock mulches tend to let water through pretty fast, and they're non-flammable, but they don't do as good a job of retaining moisture, and they sometimes overheat for heat-sensitive plants. So no perfect answers. You deal with the specifics of your individual planting situation. Maintaining plant health. Plants that are watered correctly, fertilized correctly, and disease-free will stay disease-free, or tend to. And they'll also tend to have more tolerance for unpleasant brief conditions like sudden hot snaps or brief inundation and flooding. Maintaining these healthy plants is also very critical for fire suppression. Dead, dying, and damaged plants catch fire much more readily than thriving, healthy green plants. Again, mulching is relevant here, reduces water loss and also reduces heat stresses. And be aware of what's going on around you. Pay attention. You do this professionally, and I can walk through the nursery and tell my watering staff, you know, those plants over there are dry without ever approaching them. You can see just the initial minimal changes. Awareness, develop an awareness and eye for the plants that are around you, and realize when something is off, then investigate and see what needs to be done about it. So how do we apply these 4 easy strategies in specific situations in the garden and landscape? Vegetable gardening, other edible gardening applies here too. So wet issues, flooding issues. Is it too wet to winter garden? Is it too wet to get an early start on the garden? Raised beds, whether that's formally structured raised beds, which I kind of dislike for a variety of reasons, but they're useful, or simply creating an elevated area, berming the entire vegetable garden. This becomes very, very valuable in terms of being able to garden in the wetter parts of the year. You don't even have to do the whole garden. You can create a minor mounding with trenches on both sides of it, and that does great for like getting peas started in the winter when the soil is just saturated. So large scale or small scale, get the soil up to improve your drainage situation. You can also, as I did at home, create some curtain drains or French drains where your surface water can collect and fill them up with rocks so that they're not a standing pool of muddy water. You need to be aware that takes some scale of space that you're giving up to do it. So the entire back perimeter of my garden has a trench that's basically 3 feet wide, 4.5 feet deep. And it all funnels to one corner where I excavated an area that's 4.5 feet deep by about 6 by 6. And that's all filled with round rock. So I got weed barrier fabric and then round rock. It doesn't solve all my wet problems, but it tends to channel the water away from the actual vegetable garden itself out to the perimeter, giving me workable space on the other side of the vegetable garden for that. In the vegetable garden, group your crops by water need. Also, be aware that most people hugely overwater their vegetable garden to a ridiculous degree. And we'll talk in the next slide here about a little bit about dry gardening, but in native soils that are well planned and well amended, some crops don't need any summer water. A surprising number of crops don't need any summer. But even if you don't go all the way to a true dry garden, you can reduce that irrigation. You really shouldn't be watering your vegetable garden in native soil in the ground every day. Every 2 or 3 days is quite sufficient if you're watering thoroughly. That being said, raised beds or bermed crops need more. This is my biggest complaint about raised beds and why I tore out all the raised beds and just elevated my entire vegetable garden. The transition zones you're creating when you're creating a hard structure and the soil's up against it, this dries out really fast. It's really common to need to irrigate a raised bed vegetable garden daily or sometimes more frequently than daily during the hottest part of the summer because they lose water so fast. Watering need will depend on site, your soil, but also on the crop chosen. And so we can group, like I said, we can group the plants together. You can selectively water the crops that need more water, not water the crops that need less water. But that requires an investment of time, thought, and effort rather than just setting a sprinkler out there and turning it on.
Yeah.
Already in the morning, we talked about that already. And in the vegetable garden, utilize mulches, compost mulches in particular, that are not nitrogen negative, because that's a big limitation on any annual crop, to conserve moisture. In the dry garden, we take it another step further and we dust mulch. We actually chop up the incipient weeds that are coming up in areas around our crops, and we rake that soil that we've chopped up over it as a dirt mulch or a dust mulch. And that does a wonderful job of creating a transition that doesn't lose moisture.
More with a lot of places. Yeah. I mean, Fred Myers is talking all the time. Right. Yeah.
Utilize organic pest solutions and organic fertilizers. Organic fertilizers feed the soil, then the soil feeds the plant. You build up a soil biology. Soil biology is incredibly resilient. It tends to hold moisture when moisture is available and then release it as it's needed. It tends to mediate the nitrogen exchange in the soil to make nitrogen sources that are coming in into forms that plants can use. Soil biology is very important, and organic fertilizers promote soil biology rather than stripping it out. Similarly, tillage. There's a strong movement now for no-till gardening. I do not do that at home, but I don't discourage it. There are pros and cons to not disturbing the soil. Not disturbing the soil by tilling it up or chopping it deep tends to promote healthier root zones, better soil biology, again, both macro and micro, and tends to decrease compaction and lamination. It decreases the tendency of the soil to create layers that water don't go through. But decreasing turnover in soil biology has a price too. So if you are tending to have a lot of soil pests, like some phylums, for example, the solution is to till more. In addition, a lot of forms of cover cropping for soil improvement really assume that you are going to be tilling that cover crop in. Pretty hard to work with in other ways. That being said, there are cover crops for no-till as well. And no-till is a very valid and scientific approach to managing your soil. It's just not the only way to manage your soil well. Better soil means healthier plants. Healthier plants are more resilient. Diversify, just like in everything else. Don't plant 10 of one type of tomato. Plant 1 of 10 types of tomato. You will find they perform differently under different conditions. Don't be such a fanatic tomato gardener that you don't grow any cole crops, alliums, legumes. It's very important to be able to rotate crops, not plant the same crop in the same soil year over year, because that tends to create problems. Interplant. So we have this tendency in the vegetable garden to mimic farming. Uniform blocks, long straight rows, right? Farmers do that for a reason. They're trying to mechanize. They're trying to reduce the labor input by making things very uniform. That's not necessarily the ideal situation in a home vegetable garden. And the ability to intermix different crops together can promote pest and disease resistance in particular. Just be aware that you don't want to put the crops that really need frequent watering, like lettuce or onions, right next to the crops like potatoes and garlic that you want to dry down at least at the end of their harvest season. And so interplanting has its limits. Companion planting. Intentionally planting specific crops side by side that are synergistic, that will encourage each other's development, or planting non-crop plants in the vegetable garden to encourage pest resistance or pollinator activity. Includes planting herbs in the garden, but also all kinds of flowering plants. These are ways to substantially diversify your vegetable garden and increase its resilience. Weed control is often an under-recognized facet of resilience. Everything that is growing where you do not want it is basically, by definition, a weed. And weeds take resources, water resources, nutrient resources, light resources. Many weeds are also a harbor for a variety of disease and insect problems. And so reducing or eliminating your weeds in a specific plant will dramatically increase your crop resilience. So talk about crop selection in the vegetable garden. Here's some crops that don't require anywhere near as much water as you think. Tomatoes, squashes, all forms of squash, melons, most melons. Leaf crops are few and far between for severe low water crops, but kale. And this year I did chard in my dry garden with really good success. Potatoes within reason, bush beans within reason, peppers, not as great as tomatoes, but all in all fairly drought tolerant. So those are all good crops that don't require as much water. Comparisons then from the other end of the scale, most leaf crops, lettuce and spinach in particular, need quite a bit of water. Cucumbers need quite a bit of water. Peas need more water, though often pea crop is done by the time water demand becomes severe. In the picture there, my first successful harvest of sweet potatoes unirrigated. 12 pounds. Right. So it is doable, but this does not necessarily have to be dry gardening. This can also just be simply don't water them as frequently. Get some good deep waterings and let them go surface dry a little bit more between waterings. The actual dry garden might look something like this. So this is my dry garden a couple of years ago. So every year I split my garden. Half of it I'll irrigate, half of it I don't. And I'll flip-flop the sides year over year, so I'm not overstressing the soil. You need to do that or fallow your dry gardens so that you don't really destroy your soil profile over time with lack of water for an entire summer like that. So you see the spacing out there, and these are all variety crops that can be grown with literally zero irrigation. Tomatoes, melons, zucchini is a huge champion, but most squashes. Planted appropriately in the appropriate sites, watered by hand with a watering can once at planting, usually in early to mid-May, and then I never water them. So quite doable. There's a limited palette of plants you can do that with, but it's quite doable. Does not work in raised beds. They lose water too fast. Doesn't work really great on well-drained hillsides for the same reason. They dry out too fast. There are some specific techniques. We do check out our YouTube videos. There's a dry vegetable class on there. I do a whole session on that and ways to make that work. But quite doable. People who are watering their tomatoes every night when they get home are not doing themselves or the environment any service. There are trade-offs in this. So raised beds are a good example of that. Raised beds make early planting easy. They warm up faster, they dry out faster, which means early season and winter gardening is simple. They sometimes dry out too fast. It means your watering needs more attention. There's these interfaces that you don't have in a native soil environment where the hard surface and the soil meet. This becomes a space where bugs and weeds grow really readily. So you have to police them a little bit more. Raised beds are eminently suited for no-till culture because you're already creating an artificial kind of stratified soil in there, and you can just maintain it without constantly tilling it up. It's a little harder to do in native clay soils where things compact anyway. You can plant in blocks by water demand to reduce your water usage. We've said that a couple times, but the caveat to that is you have to be intentional about your irrigation application for that to work. You set up different zones or water on different days, so you're not applying the same water over the entire garden, or that concept doesn't work. There are crops that really need to be planted in blocks, whether that's pole beans and pole peas, because it only makes sense really to run a long row of them, or things like corn that are wind pollinated that need to be pretty adjacent for pollination to happen at all. So it's not a foolproof plant, but it's a viable approach to reduce your water use. So that kind of blocking together of closely related plants does make sense, but that doesn't necessarily mean you should block like all of your cauliflower and broccoli together, even though they have the same nutrient and water needs. Because having very closely related plants all in a mass together tends to attract and intensify problems from disease and insect pressure. So as you see in my garden, I tend to diversify things out, except for the things that really have to be blocked together. Lawn and turf. I will preface this and I will finish this by saying the same thing. Consider other alternatives, please. So, problem with lawns, of course, they are monoculture planting that is nutrient intensive, water intensive, and labor intensive to maintain, as well as usually pesticide intensive, because if you put that much time and effort in it, you want it to look good, not so. Ways to make your lawn and turf areas more resilient. Improve the drainage. We are on wet, miserable soils. Fall grass will tolerate that. It doesn't thrive on that. Wet soils also host some specific problems, both some specific disease problems in the winter, but also crane fly, one of our biggest insect pests on turf, preferentially lays eggs on quite wet soils. And so the wetter your location is, the more likely you are to have crane fly problems. Diversify your turf. This can be as simple as not planting all ryegrass or all fescue, but doing a blend of rye and fescue. Again, more resilient, specifically in the disease resistance sphere. Some grasses are inherently more drought tolerant, typically your fescues for turf grasses out here. Some of them are inherently faster at filling in from physical damage, typically things like ryegrass and bentgrass. So blending those types of grass together give you some of the benefits of both. Consider incorporating non-grass plants into your turf. Things like yarrow and clover are plants that you can grow into a turf that you mow and fertilize and all the same thing as usual, but they add some resilience to drought, in some cases some flooding resilience as well, resilience to shade, and biodiversity for pollinators. Water consistently. If you're going to have a turf, you've got a couple of options. You can keep it green. To keep it green, this means you're applying about 1.5 inches of water per week. If that's not coming from the sky, you have to provide it. You really shouldn't be doing that 10 to 15 minutes at a time every day. You should be doing that 2 to 3 times a week, applying a heavier dose of water. Exactly how long that is completely dependent upon what kind of irrigation application method you're using. The way to figure this is to get a cat food can or a tuna fish can and put it out in the middle of the yard and turn on whatever irrigation device you're running. Time it. When that's full, that's 1 inch of water. So that's typically 60 or 80 minutes, depending on the irrigation application device. Then you break that up into, divide it by 2 or divide it by 3 to break it up into individual run times for each time you run. Your other approach is something that I don't see happening enough out here, but we're seeing more of it than we ever used to. Brown lawns, but maintaining them alive and healthy. So you can just ignore your lawn once you've mowed it the last time in late June or early July and let it go brown. But it doesn't really come back well from there for most grass, and depending on the year, of course. If you apply water once or twice a month on brown turf, it won't start really growing. You won't have to mow it and feed it, but it will keep the roots and crowns alive. And so it will resurge more effectively as the rains come in the fall. Defensible space around foundations. So don't grow your turf all the way up to your garden shed or your house. You can water it to the point of reduced flammability, but there's always flame risk in turf because there's always a dead duff layer underneath. Unless it was fresh watered, it can catch fire. Mow to a healthy height. So we already talked in the fire safe a little bit about below 4 inches as being a lower risk of spreading or laddering fuel out. But much below 4 inches, and grass doesn't reach its potential for root development. So if you can mow in that 3 to 4 inch zone, this will do a batch of things. First of all, you have a deeper root system. That deeper root system will be more nutrient efficient and much more water efficient, much more tolerant. It will also tolerate flooding better because it doesn't actually, you have a lot more roots that can rot out before you see damage. It also reduces some insect pests, again, particularly crane fly. I stopped having crane fly problems in my wet soil garden in northeast Corvallis when I just set my mower at the top setting, because their ovipositors only go so far, and eggs that are dropped on the stems and leaves of grass don't develop, only eggs that reach the soil. develop. So longer turf, more resilience. Again, organic pesticides and organic fertilizers, always a good idea. And be aware of weed control issues in your turf. So there aren't a lot of good broadleaf, selective, organic, low impact herbicides. There are a very few. They're quasi-organic. They're not truly organic, but are lower impact. There are herbicides that use chelated iron, HEDTA iron, that kill broadleafs very effectively, but grass doesn't process iron like that. They're not complete root killers, but they kill the leaves and they can suppress broadleaf weeds in a turf very nicely. Be particularly aware of weed and feed products. So even if you're using synthetic pesticides, herbicides for your lawn for broadleaf weed problems, when you spray them on, you spray them where the plants are. Those types of herbicides are absorbed through the foliage. You can get in, then it becomes systemic to the plant and kill the whole plant. Weed and feeds are granular water solubles. They go into the soil, they're absorbed through the root systems. It means they're both persistent in the soil and motile. They go down and they go across. If you got your nice, beautiful shade tree in the middle of your lawn and you weed and feed it a few times, you can very easily kill that tree by weed and feed. The herbicides go right down, it's absorbed through the tree's root system. But again, I will finish as I started on lawn and turf. Consider alternatives, whether that's meadows, whether that's incorporated non-grass plants into your turf, whether that's planting ground covering plants rather than turf, are all more sustainable. There's a reason why turf is so prevalent, though. And turf is one of the least expensive ways to cover space as far as an initial installation cost. Okay. And despite my diatribes, I have lawn at home, yes, I do. Despite my diatribes about it, turf is better than astroturf, is better than pavement, is better than impervious structures in terms of heat resilience for people and the plants around it, and in terms of water control. So drought-tolerant grasses and meadows. So in a grass mix, fescues are more tolerant than rye. Rye is more tolerant than bent. Flue is somewhere in between. Mixtures of the grasses are better. In addition to general resilience, we worry about the sheer amount of petroleum products used in mowing. Certainly you can use manual mowers and things like that, but they're also making grass mixes now that are either low mow or no mow mixes, ones that are designed to grow only so big and not need any kind of substantial or frequent mowing. So consider that if you're putting in a new turf. Adding clover or other short flowers, and so this can be Bellis daisies, this can be forget-me-nots, this can be yarrow. Short plants that tolerate mowing without dying out is the key criteria there. Incorporate them into your lawn. But if you can tolerate some larger spaces, and again, when we get outside of that 100-foot around the house type of situation, you might be able to tolerate more of a meadow look. And so native grasses and native wildflowers, and they're available as seed blends as well. You don't have to plant individual sprigs or plants out there. Can give you a wide, nice biodiversity and good drought tolerance, and in many cases, good water adaptability as well. But they do require a taller look to maintain the overall diversity of the mix in the first place. It's not something you're going to mow all the time, though they can be occasionally mowed, which is critical when you start talking about fire suppression in those environments. So only green or well-watered turf has any degree of fire resistance at all. Lawns are an inexpensive way to cover space and better than hard surfaces, and at least they have reasonable resilience, but it does depend a little bit upon what your expectations are out of them. But the sheer amount of water, fertilizer, mowing, and other labor that goes into maintaining a good-looking and healthy lawn really is hard to justify when you're talking about environmental responsibility and resilience. So consider alternatives. So resilience in the landscape broadly. Plant more diversity of plants, more diversity of plant families, more diversity of specific genetics within the plant groups. Utilize more native plants. They're finally readily available on the marketplace. Not everything is, but there's a good range of native plants that you can just walk into nurseries and buy without having to chase in special order all the time. So many of them are super adaptive and specifically adapted to both dry and wet conditions. Select plants from more drought tolerant, or if your situation is more the other way, more wet tolerant conditions. And there we'll cover a couple of lists in a moment. Rain gardens provide sites that are both winter wet and summer dry, and there are specific plant lists designated for rain garden development. Mulching improves your soil nutrition, reduces water loss, and reduces overall stress, and promotes a better soil biology, and is generally a good idea in all landscaping applications, as well as being aesthetic. Plant more fire-resistant plants, and that's often a tricky thing, so you'll be resorting to some lists for that. Plan defensible space. Your defensible space is defined as within about 5 feet of the house, you should have non-flammable mulches, no flammable plants in adjacence to, and clear space. In other words, there's deciduous shrubs that are not flammable, great choice, but keep some space around the house that's free of highly flammable resources. Overhead flame risk, keep away from 10 feet around the house. The distance from basically the 5-foot gap to the 30-foot gap should not have high combustion plants. Again, juniper is a classic example of a high combustion plant. And your overall fire zone, protection zone should be around 100 feet around any structures. If you're on slopes or dense woods, maybe 200 feet. Pay attention within those zones. Within those zones, clear space around groupings of plants and make sure you're controlling your ladder fuels so the trees do not get involved in a small blaze becoming a very large conflagration. Thin your tree density to a healthy density in terms of plant health, topple risk and such, but also so that fire doesn't readily spread canopy to canopy within your tree groups. Again, limited and judicial use of pesticides is in order. Pay attention to what's happening, treat it when it needs to happen, treat it fast, and try not to let it get out of control to where you need to do more extensive interventions. And utilize the best watering practices: deep watering, infrequent watering, group plants with similar water needs on similar timings, and water in the morning to reduce evaporative losses. Okay, so we'll talk about a few plant lists before I send you home with some other resources you can chase. So, native plants for home landscapes, some really good choices. Drought-tolerant native plants: California lilac, ceanothus, Western mock orange, Philadelphia lewisia, red flowering currant, very, very adaptable in a dry location. For flowers, Western columbine, typically an upland species, tolerates some moisture, but tolerates drying out pretty well as well. Romer's fescue, one of our native grasses, very good drought tolerance as well as wet soil tolerance. And pearly everlasting, you find it everywhere from literally the sand line at the beach up to several thousand feet in the mountains and in most environments that are not wet. The other end of that spectrum, wet tolerant natives. Western spirea, a much underutilized shrub here. Pacific ninebark, if you go along the riverbanks out here, it's one of 3 major shrubs you'll see growing in those periodic but not every year floodplains. Red twig dogwood, snowberry. And for flowers, camas, of course, typical wetland plant here with limited tolerance for drying out. Checker mallows, or sedalcias, we have several species here, and many of them are wet tolerant enough we use them in ponds. They will tolerate that much moisture as long as it's not stagnant, static water. More commonly, they're in emergent wetland environments where they are quite wet in the winter and then dry down fairly well in the summer. And then blue-eyed grass, which grows almost everywhere on the valley floor, you just don't see it because it's so small. Some resilient plants from other regions of the world. Drought-tolerant plants. Smoke tree, Cotinus. An excellent fall color tree with interesting summer flower pattern and very good drought tolerance. Rock rose from Western Europe. Rock roses are evergreen shrubs in a variety of sizes with early summer flowering and very good persistence and a surprising adaptability. They don't mind clay soil as long as it's not waterlogged in the winter clay. So site specifics do matter a bit. Potentilla, we could argue that's a native, but what we have actually, potentillas are primarily clonals or hybrids from our native potentilla. We see native potentilla 8,000 and 9,000 feet in the mountains all the time. But the garden selections are not pure native and are very far removed in many cases from the parent species. Deciduous shrub, good flower presentation, extremely good drought tolerance. Smaller flowering plants, cone flowers, and black-eyed Susans, very closely related plants. Asters of all sorts, native asters and non-native asters. And Russian sage, a much underutilized plant. It's a huge pollinator reference. Even the native bee guys at OSU say, plant more Russian sage. Even the native bees love it. Very long bloom season, late in the season, and extremely drought tolerant. On the other hand, for very wet sites or sites that you expect periodic flooding, Tupelo and red maple, excellent shade trees, but with real stature. They don't require summer irrigation here, unlike some of the other East Coast stuff, but they do tolerate periodic flooding very well. Shrubs, on the shrub scale, summer sweet and Virginia sweet spire. So Virginia sweet spire is a late spring to early summer blooming shrub that holds its foliage late, but it's not evergreen. The bigger forms get about 6 feet tall. The smaller ones are usually 2 to 3 feet tall, and kind of a unique flower with a really good fall foliage interest. Clethra, or summer sweet, is available in pink flowered and white flowered forms, and it's a late summer, August and September bloomer with very nice fragrance and huge pollinator attraction. Inkberry holly, an evergreen shrub. So it's a small leaf holly that's not prickly. It looks a lot like the Japanese hollies, but it's not. It's an eastern U.S. species. Very wet soil tolerant, unusual for broadleaf evergreen. And lots of flowers. In no particular, iris is super adaptable and will tolerate quite a bit of moisture periodically. Some fire-resistant plants. Maples. Most deciduous trees for the most part. Maples have a particularly good reputation for fire resistance. Ornamental shrubs, daphne, currants, both edible currants and red flowering currants, mock orange, lilacs, and spireas. For perennials and ground covers, fire resistance, yarrow, penstemon, carpet bugle or ajuga makes a great ground cover for a more fire resistant look. Irises again, hostas, lupins, and dahlias. Be aware that lupins, if they're not irrigated, go brown and they can be big. They can provide, they're fire resistant within limits, and when they're bone dry, they're big enough to create some fuel load. Here's some stellar selection, some of the plants that really go both ways or optimize a variety of different challenges. Maples again, native maples, vine maple, big leaf maple, and particularly red maple, because they all tolerate quite reasonable amounts of moisture as well as drought, and are quite fire resistant. They also are critical habitat for a variety of mammals and birds, so very, very valuable from that standpoint. Maples are also great bee plants for early flying native bees and honeybees. Maple flowering is a very important time for bees. Mock orange, native or introduced. Great fire resistance, great pollinator habitat. They provide some shelter for birds as well. They will not, our native will tolerate a fair amount of brief flooding, but not long-term submersion. And they're quite drought tolerant. Again, the plant I've seen all down here on the valley floor a lot and clear up at high elevations in the mountains. Very adaptable plant. Spirea, both native and non. Spireas are fire resistant, drought tolerant, wet soil tolerant, as long as they're not underwater for long periods of time. And our native doesn't care. If you walk Jackson Fraser wetland out there, it's a really good example of large scale plantings of spirea, because that's what grows out there in the wild before those sites were cleared. So a big showy flowered pink flower with huge pollinator attraction for a very long period of time. And it can actually tolerate being underwater for weeks to months at a time, and yet still tolerate soils that dry out to the cracking point in summer. So extremely adaptable. Currants, red flowering currant, anything that's not flooded. It's fire resistant. It's a huge draw for pollinators. It's a huge draw for birds and mammals on the fruit. But it's not very wet soil tolerance. It's only a significant drawback. And lilacs, while they're neither supremely wet soil tolerant nor huge pollinator resource, they are very adaptable to a wide variety of conditions and have enough attraction to bees to be worth mentioning. In perennials, yarrow, it's really hard to beat yarrow. It blooms for a long time, late in the season during a critical habitat period. Where conditions are appropriate, it might grow up into a larger perennial, 30 inches. Where conditions are more suited, it will grow flat along the ground and kind of spread as a carpet. Penstemon. So you need to be a little selective about penstemons depending on what your primary characteristic you're seeking. There are penstemons from very dry climates. There's very arid penstemons. Our native penstemons tend to be emergent wetland species. They tolerate quite a bit of moisture, but aren't maybe quite as drought tolerant, or at least don't look as good under dry conditions as some of the more arid penstemons. Again, carpet bugle, fire-resistant ground cover, covers a large swath of space, reasonably water-wise, does not require substantial amounts of water, nice dense cover, and a pollinator plant as well. Lupins, iris, camas, columbine. We have native members of all of those, and they're all well worth incorporating even into non-native gardens. So some more resources for you. I would love to talk more detail, but we're over time as is. I talk too much. Some plant selection resources, and feel free to take pictures of these, write these notes down, or we'll get this posted on YouTube eventually. You can go back and check the slide out. Water efficient plants for the Willamette Valley this actually got several sponsors. I grabbed this link from the Corvallis, Oregon Public Works page. Gardening with native plants west of the Cascades, OSU Extension, covers a wide range of native plants and where they fit into ecosystems and how you can utilize them in the landscapes. And specifically, USDA has a fire-resistant plants for Oregon home landscapes, a valuable resource. It's not always obvious what plants are and are not fire-resistant, so it's really good to spend some time with those lists. And planting and techniques, the home ignition zone, protecting your property from wildfire, from OSU Extension. A very brief, you can get larger scale versions of that with a lot more in-depth, but it's a really great primer and includes a little chart for you to kind of fill out your zones of space, your risk zones, and explore how you're doing on your firewise and how to improve it. The Oregon Rain Garden Guide for creating sites that absorb surface runoff and can tolerate severe wet conditions, but also dry down in the summer. The Intro to Dry Farming in Oregon, Dry Farming the Maritime Pacific Northwest, OSU publication, excellent resource, focused more on agricultural scale, but adaptable to home scale. And then from the Xerces Society, Western Oregon and Washington, hedgerow planting for pollinators. It's easy, relatively speaking, to seek out information on things like pollen resources and nectar resources of various plants. What's harder is those specifics like butterfly larval source habitat and things like that. And this is where this resource becomes extremely valuable. So that's what I had for you today. I'm going to take one question online, then I'll ask any questions from folks here. So I have a question: how can we create a defensible space and still have shade on or near the house? Well, that is a challenge. There's definitely a balancing act that has to go on. You can have shade trees adjacent to the house, but not canopying over the roof. You want to keep your 10-foot clearance from branches of shade trees to the house. So you've got a two-story house and you put a 50-foot shade tree 20 feet away from the house on the sunny facings, on the south facing or the west facing. You have shade on the house. You don't have the whole house shaded, but it is a substantial improvement. That's probably the biggest thing you can do. The other thing beyond that is look at other ways of cooling, which include directing airflow. Be aware that plants and hard surfaces handle airflow difference. When you put a wall or a fence in, you create a break point, and you have a brief acceleration of wind patterns around that break point, and then typically a fairly rapid dispersal from that. When you have a high canopy and a low ground cover with only sporadic shrubs in between, while air goes through that. In addition, canopy of trees creates their own vectors, their own air movement patterns. And air movement is as valuable for cooling as direct shade in many cases. No perfect answers for you on that. It is a compromise, and in many cases, the fire safety far outweighs the risks of spending a little more money on air conditioning or other cooling mechanisms. Questions from the group here? Yes, go ahead.
If we have only ashes left after they logged together, how do I know if the border is in, or is there any way to look at them and see?
How do you know which?
The insect, the ash borer.
Oh, the ash borer. Yeah, okay. So a situation that's been logged off there, but this concern is about invasive pest ash borer still present in the trees that were the stumps or logs of the trees. So first thing is cleanliness, dead wood removal. That's the single biggest criteria you can do there.
Clean now.
It's clean now because it's all been burned down. Secondarily, I'm not worried about anything below soil with ash borer. So not in the roots and the low crowns. This is a trunk and branch problem. Emerald ash borer is somewhat difficult to learn to diagnose. Download the brochure. Okay. And there's a couple of other brochures that go with that, but the emerald ash borer is an specific identification for emerald ash borer brochure. So basically, you pay attention to ash trees in the late spring and early summer, and you're looking for adults. You can also look for the very distinctive D-shaped hole, and it's small, going through the bark into the inner bark, into the heart of the tree. Most borers are relatively round in the hole they leave behind. The emerald ash borer is distinctively D-shaped. It's got a flat side.
Thank you.
Question?
You excuse me, you had mentioned rain gardens. Have you seen any need or for rain harvesting a la rain barrels?
Sure. And so question is, talk about rain gardenings and water conservation and direction in that sense. How about rain harvesting, rain barrels and such? Yes, valid approach, much more intensive to implement than most of what we've been talking about here. There's a lot of infrastructure that goes into that. You have to figure out how to store the water and or use the water efficiently as well. Best approach I have seen is a comprehensive gutter system that drains into a central point, and you put a water feature in there that is a pondless water feature. So water channels into that, and it's all gravel and stream. You don't have open water. That becomes your holding tank. That becomes your water reservoir. Then you put a sump at the bottom of that you can turn on to draw water out of that. And you put a gauge in there that gives you at least some idea how much water is in there, so you know when you need to stop draining out. So rain harvesting like that is valuable, and I think will become an increasing approach. We're not seeing a ton of people doing it now. Our landscape crew has done some of that. We have our one water feature out here is set up specifically for that. Big challenge is it doesn't last long enough, but it's a good impact if you want to reduce your early season water costs and water utilization, to utilize water you stored over the winter. The other limiting factor is you have to plan overflow, because you're not going to store as much water as is coming down. So those are caveats to that. But yes, we are seeing more and more interest in that specific application. Keep in mind that ways of getting water out and water storage are complicated. The best approach agriculturally is to pump it uphill while it's coming down. Put it in a big tank, make sure it's sealed so you don't have algae development. And then you don't have to pump it out. You just open the cock, you get X amount, sorry, my math's not great, X amount of pounds of pressure per foot of elevation drop, so or head height, and you can actually apply your irrigation water directly out of the tank that way. And that's a very good approach too, if you have the infrastructure and space to make that practical. Other questions here or at home? Yes.
Is there I'd like to do companion planting. So
Yeah.
that I don't have to specify it.
Yeah.
But it does seem like I end up with plants that need more, have different water differences. And I was wondering if you have a resource for that.
So the question is resources for companion planting, and specifically one of the things that doesn't get talked about in companion planting a lot is the differences in water need amongst these plants and incorporating them into your vegetable garden. I don't, it's so much experiential at that point. So I tend to use calendulas and zinnias. Zinnias are pretty dry tolerant, pretty adaptable. And they integrate well in. So do Mediterranean herbs. This year, for the first time, I started throwing serious amounts of herbs into the dry garden as well. So oregano survived the entire summer with zero irrigation and still growing. Basil, on the other hand, doesn't take that. You do need to be aware of that. And cilantro, if you're growing it for coriander, is fine. You get the one coriander harvest, but it has no persistence in it as cilantro in an unirrigated state. But Mediterranean herbs broadly, lavender, if you want something a little more persistent. So I've got great resources on companion planting and as far as plant selection, but not so much on their individual drought tolerance. But if you'd like, we can go through the list and I'll tick mark a few examples that would be good. We've got a handout up at the front counter for
You
that.
could add rosemary to that.
Rosemary. My problem with rosemary is it's a little big for the dry garden, or for the vegetable garden. That's that 3x3. But yeah, very tolerant of zero irrigation. Bay tree. I've got one on the edge of my garden. Also very tolerant of zero irrigation. Yes.
I've got about a 60-foot Hinoki cedar, and it's this time of year it gets a whole bunch of brown needles.
Right. So, question: Hinoki cypress or Hinoki cedar? This time of year, showing a lot of brown needles. So, this is inherent in a lot of conifers. They keep their needles for a given period of time. They shed the interior older needles down. You will see variation from year to year in how bad that is. Some species are very prone to it, particularly very dense and bractifoliage species like arborvitae and Hinoki cypress. So that's a risk, a fire risk, to retain foliage in there. It's not a health problem per se. The things you can do that reduce it: some summer irrigation, so you get a heavier die out on dry years. Fertilization, larger expanses of new growth, less amount of brown growth, and they're able to use. So the reason foliage dies back and declines is not just age, it's about the plant cannibalizing resources to continue putting on new growth. If you provided available nitrogen, it doesn't have to cannibalize as hard on the older growth to keep pushing new growth out. Cleanliness, doing sanitation under the tree for fire resilience is again the biggest concern there. But that's a fairly normal thing. It's not per se a health risk, and it doesn't make them usually unsuitable in an aesthetic sense as well. But I do worry about the amount of foliage accruing in there as in terms of fire risk in particular. Yes.
So defensible space, I have pine trees and a lot of needles that come down.
Yeah.
And rake them away,
Mhm.
pile them up, and add organics to our clay soil.
Right.
So can I wait for it to get brown and use that as a reason for organic, or is it too acidic, or what?
Okay, so pine needles, lots of pine needles around and heavy shed. Is it suitable for use as an organic mulch, or should it be composted, and what are the restrictions? Okay, so let's talk a couple of things about pine trees. First of all, pine trees shed a lot of needles. Those needles are an ignition risk. Most pine trees are pretty darn fire resistant. In other words, they don't ignite well and they survive burning. But that is a relative term. You have lots of dead branches and lots of dead needles in the tree as well as down, and then ladder fuels, they become a risk of spreading to other trees, certainly. That's a thing. Composting them is the best approach to dealing with the volume of needles, even though it's a kind of a long, slow process. Pine needles have terpenes, which are plant inhibiting compounds. It slows down their decomposition in the compost pile, but it also can inhibit growth. That being said, it's only relevant for plants that's a real risk for. So most shrubs, using it as a mulch around other shrubs, it's usually not a big issue. They are pretty acidic, so you want to be cautious about things like lilac and daphne that are really significantly alkaline plants. But rhodies, azaleas, camellias all do quite well with a pine needle mulch. Like all brown material mulches, it's nitrogen negative. If you're going to put a layer down, put a little bit of fertilizer under it, so that the decomposing organisms that are breaking down the pine needles have a nitrogen source and aren't just stealing all the nitrogen from their surrounding soil and starving it. All right, well, thank you all for coming. Thank you all for attending online. I appreciate it. And you guys know where to find me if you have follow-up questions. We will eventually get around to getting this edited and posted, and you can review it on our YouTube channel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you, Darren.
thanks.